In this video, we're going over the 6 stages of the Shang Han Lung and the 4 levels of Wen Bing, and we're going to review some of the single herbs that are used at each stage. This is a video that I actually made for the single herb review course, but so many people asked me about this that I decided to just upload it to the YouTube channel. So if you want to get the handouts and follow along, there's a link below where you can download them. When it comes to febrile diseases, that is, you get sick and you have a fever, there are 2 schools of thought in Chinese medicine, the cold damage school and the warm disease school. The cold damage school is based on the Shang Han Lung by Zhong Zhongjing. The idea here is cold pathogens enter the body through the skin and muscle layer and then work their way through the 6 channels, Taiyang, Yangming, Shaoyang, Taiyin, Shaoyin, Jueyin. The warm disease school is based on the Wen Lung by Ying and Xue. Here, the idea is febrile diseases are caused by heat pathogens entering the body through the nose and mouth and then penetrating through the 4 levels or the 4 aspects, Wei level, Qi level, Ying level, and Xue level. Now, these might sound like 2 opposing theories. I mean, one is based on cold and one is based on heat, but since this is Chinese medicine, we accept both of them as being true at the same time. So we'll just use one or the other depending on the situation. So let's start with the Shang Han Lung and the 6 levels. If a cold pathogen attacks the body from the outside, its first stop is going to be the Taiyang level. Taiyang is the most exterior channel, so it's the first to get hit by an exterior attack. And this is basically an exterior attack of wind cold. So we'll see things like fever, aversion to wind or aversion to cold, headache, and stiff neck and back. If you think about the pathway of the Taiyang channel, both the bladder channel and the small intestine channel go to the neck and upper back. So that's why we have stiff neck and upper back. But when it comes to the Taiyang level, we can actually further break this down into 2 types, excess and deficiency. For Taiyang excess, we'll see fever and aversion to cold, an absence of sweating, and a floating tight pulse. For Taiyang deficiency, we'll see fever and aversion to cold, a presence of sweating, and a floating moderate pulse. So with Taiyang excess, the idea is we have an excess pathogen blocking the pores so the sweat can't get out. So that's why we see an absence of sweating. With Taiyang deficiency, there's deficiency on the exterior. So the pores are unsound and they can't hold the sweat in. So the sweat leaks out, but it does so in a way that's insufficient to expel the pathogen. Notice that there's also a difference in the pulse. Taiyang excess comes with a floating tight pulse. Remember, the tight pulse is kind of like a wiry pulse, but it's larger in diameter and more forceful. So instead of feeling like a thin wire, it feels more like a tightly wound rope. And this usually indicates excess cold. So the pulse is floating because the pathogen is on the exterior, and it's tight because we're dealing with an excess condition. Whereas Taiyang deficiency comes with a floating moderate pulse, or sometimes instead of moderate, Bensky will say a lax or frail pulse. Basically, this is a pulse indicating deficiency. So for Taiyang excess, we have an excess pulse. For Taiyang deficiency, we have a deficient pulse. So for Taiyang excess, we use Ma Huang, ephedra herba, to strongly promote sweating and release the exterior. For Taiyang deficiency, we use Gui Zhi, cinnamon twig, because it had that action of harmonizing the yin and the wei. And not to get too into the weeds here, but for Taiyang deficiency, we characterize that as a disharmony of the yin and the wei, or a disharmony of the nutritive and defense aspects. And this is just referring to the situation where there's a pathogen on the exterior, but because of deficiency, the interstices are not sound and the sweat is leaking out. So in this case, we actually don't want to strongly promote sweating because the patient is already sweating. So instead, our treatment principle is to harmonize the yin and the wei. When we get to formula class, we'll actually see that for Taiyang excess, we use the combination Ma Huang plus Gui Zhi. So these 2 are working together to really promote sweating, which is what we want because remember, we're dealing with an absence of sweating. For Taiyang deficiency, we use the combination Guizhi plus Bai Shao. Remember, Bai Shao is sour in flavor, so it has an action of restraining and holding things in. And that's what we want because we're dealing with deficiency and a presence of sweating. So it's like Guizhi is acrid to push the pathogen out, but Bai Shao is sour to hold in the sweat that's leaking out through the pores. And we should probably point out that Taiyang excess also goes by the name Shang Han, or cold damage, and Taiyang deficiency is also called Zhongfeng, or wind strike. So if a cold pathogen gets into the Taiyang level and we don't expel it, it can work its way in deeper to the Yangming level, which is an internal level. And what's interesting here is as the pathogen works its way deeper from exterior to interior, it also transforms from cold into heat. So Yangming diseases are characterized by interior heat in terms of the 8 principles. So at the Yangming level, we also divide this into 2 types. But instead of excess and deficiency, we have Yangming channel and Yangming organ, or Yangming bowel. Here, the word bowel, or Chinese fu, is just the word that we use for the yang organ. So that's why we say Yangming bowel. But the point is, the pathogen is at the organ level rather than the channel level. So Yangming channel disease in the Shang Han Lung is the same as qi level heat in the Wen Bing. So there's some overlap there. And remember here, we're dealing with the Si Da, the 4 big or the 4 great symptoms. Big fever without chills, big sweat, big thirst and vexation, and a large surging pulse. So here we're dealing with a lot of heat. We have a big fever, and because this is heat at the interior level, there's no chills or aversion to cold. It's just straight up fever. There's a big sweat because heat is pushing the fluids out. There's great thirst because the fluids are being dried out by the heat. Vexation means like irritability or frustration. Basically, you're hot and bothered because of the heat. And then a large, rapid, surging pulse is a sign of heat. So the representative herb for Yangming channel disorders is Shigao, gypsum fibrosum. Or if we wanted to name 2 herbs, we could say Shigao plus Juramu, Anamorena rhizoma. Both of these come from the drain fire category, and they're often used as paired herbs, as in the formula Bai Hutong, white tiger decoction. For Yangming bowel disease, this is heat binding in the stomach and large intestine, because those are the Yangming organs. So we see things like tidal fever, delirious speech, and here's the key symptoms: abdominal fullness, distension, and hardness that's worse with pressure, and constipation. We may also see a burnt yellow tongue coat and a forceful, deep excess pulse. So again, this is heat binding in the stomach and large intestine organs. So this heat is drying up the food and binding it in the stomach. That's why we see abdominal fullness and hardness. And because it's worse with pressure, that's an indication of an excess condition. And that heat is drying up the stool, binding up the large intestine, so we see constipation. Delirious speech is just the heat affecting the heart and the shen. The pulse is forceful because this is an excess condition, and it's deep because this is at the interior level. The representative herb for Yangming bowel patterns is Da Huang, rhubarb root. Again, if we wanted to name 2, we could say Da Huang plus Mang Xiao. These are both from the purgative category. Mang Xiao is a type of salt. It can draw water into the intestines and soften hard stool. And then Da Huang comes along and pushes it out. So these 2 unbind the stomach and large intestine and also get rid of the heat. The next level after that is the Shaoyang level. This is a half external, half internal pattern. And we see things like alternating fever and chills, fullness in the chest and rib side, bitter taste in the mouth, and vomiting. The pulse is going to be wiry. So remember, Shaoyang means gallbladder and sanjiao, but here we're mostly talking about the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is prone to constraint and stagnation. So we see fullness in the chest and rib side because that's where the gallbladder channel goes. A bitter taste in the mouth is just always associated with the gallbladder. A wiry pulse sounds like liver gallbladder qi stagnation. And then we see things like retching, poor appetite, and vomiting. And this is like a wood-earth disharmony because the gallbladder qi is constrained. It interferes with the downward movement of stomach qi, so we get things like vomiting. So the representative herb for Shaoyang disorders is Chai Hu from the cool acrid release the exterior category. Or again, if we wanted to name two herbs, we could say Chai Hu plus Huang Qin. Chai Hu is an acrid herb that releases the exterior. Huang Qin is a bitter herb that drains the interior. Remember, we said that this is a half exterior, half interior condition. So it's like Chai Hu is addressing the half exterior portion of Shaoyang, and Huang Qin is addressing the half interior portion of Shaoyang. So those are the three yang levels, or they're also sometimes called the triple yang diseases. And one other thing I'll point out here is, remember we said that these are febrile diseases. So each one has fever as one of its main symptoms. But at each level, the fever presents differently. At the Taiyang level, we have simultaneous fever and chills, or we could say simultaneous fever and aversion to cold. At the Yangming level, we have fever without chills. And at the Shaoyang level, we have alternating fever and chills. So these are key symptoms to pay attention to. So at the Taiyang level, the fever is the result of a battle between the evil qi that's trying to invade and the upright qi that's defending the body. So the upright qi is fighting back against the evil qi, and that battle produces heat. And that's why we have fever. But at the same time, we also have chills or aversion to cold or aversion to wind. And what's happening here is normally we have this yang qi that diffuses over the surface of the body and warms and protects us. But here, because there's a pathogen on the exterior, that pathogen is blocking the diffusion of yang qi. So it's like we feel naked or exposed. So here, the patient will feel feverish, but they'll also want to stay bundled up because they still feel susceptible to cold and to drafts. So that's what we mean by simultaneous fever and chills. At the Yangming level, it's just fever. This is because the pathogen is at the interior level, so we no longer have to deal with this non-diffusion of yang qi over the exterior. This is just interior heat, so the patient feels hot or feverish. With Shaoyang disorder, we have alternating fever and chills. Now, some people will say that this just has to do with the half interior, half exterior nature of this condition, but I think there's a better explanation. Remember, Shaoyang means gallbladder, and the gallbladder is characterized by constraint or stagnation. So because we have this gallbladder constraint, the yang qi is not diffusing over the surface of the body. But this constraint causes the qi to build up, and eventually, like a dam that bursts, the qi floods out all at once over the surface of the body. So because you have this sudden flood of yang qi, you feel warm. But then the constraint takes over again, and the yang qi is stuck, and you feel chilled, but eventually it overflows again, and you feel warm. And this just repeats, giving you alternating fever and chills. So whenever you see alternating fever and chills, you should definitely think Shaoyang, and you should think of the herb Chai Hu. After that, we get into the three yin levels, starting with Taiyin. Taiyin disease is characterized by abdominal fullness and pain, vomiting, diarrhea, indigestion, or you could say the non-movement of food, no thirst, and the pulse is going to be weak and moderate. So normally when we say Taiyin, that means lung and spleen, but you can see here that we're really just talking about the spleen. Specifically, cold has damaged the spleen yang, so we could call this deficiency cold of the spleen. So because the spleen yang is damaged, the spleen fails to transform and transport grain and water. So we get this abdominal fullness and food that's stuck. It can even rebel back upwards, giving us vomiting. And because this transformation is not occurring, we end up with diarrhea. The pulse is weak and moderate, indicating deficiency. So the key herb here is ganjiang, dried ginger. Remember, ganjiang comes from the category herbs that warm the interior and expel cold, and is especially useful for warming the middle. So it makes sense that ganjiang is our representative herb for Taiyin disease. If we go a step further, we get to the Shaoyin level. This is debilitation of the heart and kidney. So we see things like aversion to cold, curled up lying posture. In America, we would probably say curled up in the fetal position. In China, they say curled up in the shrimp position. But basically, you're cold and weak, so you curl up. Somnolence, which is like drowsiness or wanting to sleep. Reversal cold of the limbs, so the yang is not flowing outward to the extremities, so the limbs feel cold. And the pulse is going to be fine and faint. In some cases, you may also see diarrhea with undigested food. So notice the pulse here. At the Taiyin level, we had a weak, moderate pulse, but here we have a fine, faint pulse. So we've gone from weak to faint. So this is a lot of deficiency. The patient only wants to sleep. There's not enough yang qi to warm the body and warm the limbs, so we have all these signs of cold. There may be diarrhea with undigested food because the kidney yang can no longer warm the spleen. So our representative herb here is Zhifutze, prepared aconite root. This also comes from the category herbs that warm the interior and expel cold. So I tend to think of futze as more of a kidney herb and ganjiang as more of a spleen and lung herb, but technically we actually use both of them here. Remember, both futze and ganjiang have this action of rescuing devastated yang. So technically at this stage we also have two types. There's the deficiency cold pattern that we just talked about, but there's also a deficiency heat pattern as well. Here we would see things like vexation, insomnia, dry mouth, a red or crimson tongue, and a thin, rapid pulse. Kind of what's happening here is because kidney yin is deficient, that heat flares up into the heart. But this is not really a common pattern, at least in the context of cold damage. I think Zhang Zhongjing only has a couple lines about it in the Shang Han Lung, and there he says to use the formula Huanglian Jiao Jita Huangtong. So Huanglian is clearing that heat out of the heart, and Jiao is tonifying kidney yin. But this isn't a very commonly used formula, and this isn't a very commonly talked about pattern, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But this deficiency cold pattern with Zhifutze is something that I would definitely remember. So the last stage is the Jueyin level, and because it's the last stage, it's the most severe. So Jueyin syndromes are characterized by upper body heat and lower body cold. So it's like you're so deficient that yin and yang are starting to separate. So you have heat above and cold below. So the symptoms we might see are wasting thirst, or other books will say unquenchable thirst, qi surging up into the heart. I think this is what we call running piglet qi, so like a panic attack. Pain and heat in the region of the heart, hunger with no desire to eat, and vomiting roundworms. So wasting thirst and heat in the chest are signs of upper body heat or heat in the chest, and no desire to eat and vomiting roundworms are the result of lower body cold or cold in the intestines. So I'll just say something here about vomiting roundworms since that's the symptom that everybody remembers. Kind of the idea here is in ancient China, roundworms were much more common. And if you had an externally contracted febrile disease, that could exacerbate a pre-existing roundworm condition. So it's not like Jueyin syndrome manifests roundworms out of nothing. They were probably already there to begin with. And the way this is described is sometimes kind of funny. Remember, we said that this is a condition of upper body heat and lower body cold. So it's like normally, if you were in ancient China, you would have roundworms in your intestines or in your lower body, and they would just kind of be chilling there and not really causing any problems. But when you get this condition of upper body heat and lower body cold, it's like the roundworms are suddenly like, ugh, it's cold in here. We got to move someplace warmer. So the roundworms migrate upwards to get away from the cold and seek out a warmer environment, the upper body heat. And that's what causes vomiting roundworms. So vomiting roundworms is a thing that everybody remembers, but we should probably be thinking of this as a complex condition of upper body heat and lower body cold due to deficiency. So the representative herb for Jueyin disease is Wu Mei, black plum, from the stabilize and bind category. Wu Mei is very sour, and the sour flavor enters the liver channel, which is one of the Jueyin channels. So Wu Mei can guide other herbs into the foot Jueyin liver channel. Wu Mei is also good for calming roundworms because of its sour flavor. It's like holding them in and restraining them. And Wu Mei has a famous action of alleviating thirst. Remember, unquenchable thirst was one of our symptoms. And for this level, I do want to point out that the formula we use is Wu Mei Wan. Besides Wu Mei, which is obviously the chief herb, we have a combination of certain warming herbs like Jurfutsa, Ganjiang, Guizhi, Huajiao, Xixin, plus certain cooling herbs like Huanglian and Huangbai. So the warming herbs are treating the lower body cold, but then we add in cooling herbs to descend upper body heat and descend the roundworms. So I just want to point this out to emphasize that, again, this is a condition of upper body heat and lower body cold. So those are the 6 levels of the Shang Han Lung, and a couple other things to point out. Number 1, even though the 6 stages are classically presented in this order, we do admit that this is not always how the disease progresses. For example, if we have a cold pathogen at the Taiyang level, it could progress to the Yangming stage, or it could skip a level and go directly to the Shaoyang stage. Once it's at the Shaoyang level, it may go upwards into the Yangming. Or you could have a cold pathogen that skips the yang levels entirely and goes straight to the Taiyin. We would call that a direct strike to the Taiyin level. So even though we talk about the disease progression in this order, it doesn't always necessarily happen that way. And number 2 is, it is possible for 2 stages to be affected simultaneously, and we call that a combination disease. So we can have simultaneous Taiyang and Yangming disorder, or simultaneous Yangming and Shaoyang disorder, or even all 3 yang levels all at once. And what we often find is, when we're treating these combination disorders, we're often just combining the representative herbs for each level. So, for example, Da Chai Hu Tong treats simultaneous Shaoyang and Yangming disorder. So you can see we have Chai Hu and Huang Qing to take care of the Shaoyang level, and then Da Huang to take care of the Yangming level. So that's one reason I think it's nice to know the herbs for each of the 6 stages, because you'll see them pop up in various formulas. Next, we can move on to the warm disease school and the 4 levels of the Wen Bing. This theory came about much later in terms of the history of Chinese medicine, but the idea here is that febrile diseases are caused by heat pathogens that invade the body and penetrate through the 4 levels, or the 4 aspects. Wei level, or defense aspect, Qi level, or Qi aspect, Ying level, which we can translate as nutritive level or construction aspect, depending on which book you're reading, and the Xue level, or blood aspect. So let's go through each of these. The first level is the Wei level, or defense aspect. And this is basically an exterior attack of wind heat. So we're going to see our familiar signs and symptoms. Simultaneous fever and chills, with fever more pronounced. There may be sweating or no sweating, a dry mouth, headache, cough, sore throat. The tongue may be red, and the pulse is floating and rapid. Floating because it's an exterior attack and the pathogen is on the surface, and rapid because of the heat. So when Ye Tianshi wrote the Wen Lung, he was kind of just writing about the theory of warm diseases and didn't necessarily talk a whole lot about the herbs that would be used for treatment. But since this is an exterior attack of wind heat, we're going to be using cool, acrid herbs that release the exterior, like Bo He, sangye, juhua, and niubangzi. We can also use herbs like jinyinhua and lianqiao, especially when there's sore throat. So these herbs are from the heat toxicity category, but they still have an action of releasing the exterior. So if we have heat at the Wei level and we don't expel it, that heat can move deeper into the Qi level. And like we said before, Qi level heat in the Wen Bing is pretty much the same as Yangming disorder in the Shang Han Lung. One of the differences is going to be that the progression of the disease is much quicker. Because with the Shang Han Lung, we had a cold pathogen that transforms into heat as it moves deeper. But with Wen Bing, we have a heat pathogen on the exterior that just moves deeper. So it progresses more rapidly. So again, here we're going to see the four bigs: big fever, big sweat, big thirst and vexation, and a big pulse. And the herbs we use are Shigao and Zhimu. The next two levels are the Ying and Xue levels. These two are similar in their presentation, but they differ in their severity. For the Ying level, this can be translated as the nutritive level or the construction aspect, depending on which book you're using. And here, there's a lot of heat. Fever that worsens at night, irritability, restlessness, and insomnia, indicating that heat is harassing the heart and disturbing the shen, and faint or indistinct rashes. And a key sign here is a red or crimson tongue that's usually dry. This change in the tongue indicates that heat has gotten deep into the Ying level. After that is the Xue level or blood level. This presents similarly to Ying level heat, just more severe. So instead of possible faint rashes, we'll see distinct purple maculopapular rashes. The tongue will be scarlet, possibly with prickles or thorns, and the major thing we're looking for here is bleeding. Nosebleed, coughing up blood, blood in the urine, or blood in the stool. The idea here is heat causes things to speed up. And so when heat enters the Xue level, the blood speeds up so much that it begins to move recklessly or frenetically outside of the vessels, causing bleeding. So it actually turns out that the herbs that we use for both of these stages are similar. For both Ying level and Xue level heat, we use herbs from the category herbs that cool the blood. The classical formulas use Xi Jiao, rhinoceros horn, which we obviously don't use anymore, so we substitute Shui Niu Jiao, water buffalo horn, plus other blood-cooling herbs like Shengdi Huang and Xuan Shen. So even though these two stages have similar presentations and the herbs we use to treat them are similar, we actually use different treatment strategies with each level. So with Ying level heat, we're trying to clear the heat, but we're also trying to vent the pathogen back up into the Qi level. So we use these blood cooling herbs, but we combine them with other herbs like Lian Chao and Dan Juye to vent the heat back up into the Qi level. But when we get to the blood level, there's no venting it back upwards. We have to treat the pathogen at the blood level. So we use those blood cooling herbs like Shui Niu Jiao and Shengdi Huang to treat it at the blood level. But we have an additional complication. Heat at the blood level can dry out the blood or scorch the blood, which leads to blood stasis. So we need to add in some cool, invigorating herbs like Chishao and Mudan Pi to help with that blood stasis. So that's how our treatment strategy differs between these two levels. So those are the four levels or the four aspects of Wen Bing theory. And to be honest, this was kind of a simplified overview. Some of these levels can be broken down even more. For example, with Wei level heat, we can distinguish between wind heat and wind heat with dampness. We would call that a damp warmth disease. So if there's dampness, we might see additional things like body heaviness and a thick tongue coat. And so there, we're not only going to release the exterior, but we're also going to use aromatic herbs to deal with the dampness. For Qi aspect patterns, we can actually break this down quite a bit. We can have initial stage qi aspect heat, where there's heat that's still relatively superficial. We can have exuberant heat in the lung and stomach. We can have great heat in the qi aspect, or gastrointestinal heat bind, which correspond to Yangming channel and Yangming bowel disease respectively. Or we can have damp heat in the san jiao. So it does get a little bit more complicated, but here I just wanted to present a more simplified version that corresponds to our single herb categories. So that was a basic overview of the Shang Han Lung and Wen Bing and some of our single herbs that go along with it. Be sure to download the handout that goes along with this video, but I hope that was helpful.